We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadromist here on the Anadrome. This is Burn Power coming to you from Tbilisi, Georgia, somewhere in the Caucasus Mountains, nowhere near Macon or Savannah, basically in Europe, though some people will say it's really Asia. Oh, whatever. Today, I'm going to discuss something that I've discussed in bits and pieces before, particularly on the Anadrome channel, but also I've mentioned this on the Anadromist channel as well, and I'm putting this out for both of them, but staggering the dates. But I want to talk about why horror has become the most important film genre of the 2020s. It's been a while in coming. Horror was certainly popular in the last decade, in the teens. And it certainly had a place in the aughts. The 90s was kind of a mixed period. The 80s had a lot of different horror genres arising. 70s were very important. The 60s were a transitional time, a bit like the 90s. The 50s were kind of more geared towards science fiction, and when the horror was there, it was more science fiction, until you get to Hammer films. The 40s was probably the weakest decade ever for horror films, and I think that's because there was a huge, fat, horrible war squatting in the middle of the decade. The 1930s was, in America, the classic period for particularly Universal Studios horror, Frankenstein, Dracula, that sort of thing. And in Germany in the 1920s, silent horror films from that period are absolutely amazing, and there were great horror films being made in the 1920s in America too, particularly the ones featuring Lon Chaney. So one of the things I've been thinking is that, and this has been occurring to me, we live in a strange time where horror has taken on the bulk of the messages we've been essentially giving ourselves. It's not that horror hasn't spoken before. Certainly the very end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s was another very fertile period for horror. But this time is different. And you know, there have always been horror films that had a mass cultural impact. Films like Psycho, Jaws, The Exorcist, Alien, Silence of the Lambs, Get Out, and one can think of many more. Horror has been reviled and praised, but rarely unnoticed. Horror has reflected the post-60s existentialist crisis in the 1970s. It has shown the dark underbelly in the 1980s America, the sub-zeitgeist. In the post-9/11 world, suddenly this eruption of bloodshed and such, which I think is a direct reflection of not only the World Trade Center bombings attacks, but also all the moral conflict of our going into the Middle East and trying to resolve it. And now we are facing almost unbearable uncertainties in these post-pandemic times. So much so that almost everything we know about films is being thrown out because we don't even know much about film anymore. We don't know much about music anymore. We don't know much about art anymore, about books and reading anymore. Everything is up for grabs. So, horror. Why? And I've talked a little bit about some of the different eras of horror. This is not a discussion of the history of horror, nor is it a discussion of different horror genres or great films or anything like that. This is simply asking the question, why is horror so important in our times? And what do I mean by important? Well, for one thing, in the last few years, particularly 2024 and even this year, the mainstream cinema has essentially cracked. But horror has continued on steadily. But not only continued on steadily, producing some of its best films ever. Of course, it takes a while to ascertain whether the substance is going to remain a great film, or Nosferatu, Robert Eggers' version, or whether Art the Clown will become a cultural icon for the ages. Nevertheless, there is something about this period, because the horror films aren't simply horror films. They are our reflections in a mirror of our uncertainties during this time. Now, there have always been peaks and valleys in horror, as I just mentioned in discussing the different epochs. So the 1940s, as I've already mentioned, was a valley in horror production. And there were several reasons for this. One was this big fat World War II sitting in the middle of the decade. The other is that the Universal monsters were still being produced, but it was all now sequels of sequels. Does that sound familiar? And then you had the Abbott and Costello films. So, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which also included a great final Bela Lugosi Dracula performance, and a great Lon Chaney Jr. performance of the Wolfman. Then you had Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy, Abbott and Costello Meet Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and I think there was one about ghosts. But the point is this: horror films started to become comedies. And I think when you see a period where you get more horror comedies than actual horror films, I think the late 80s is like this too, going into the 90s, you're in a period of transition. This isn't to say there aren't great horror films in the 1940s. There are some of the greatest. And they were made particularly out of RKO Studios with producer Val Lewton, who got people like Jacques Tourneur and Mark Robeson to make films that are among the best in horror film history and in film history. So the 40s was a valley. The mid-90s was a valley up until 1996. And in 1996, the Scream movie came out, Wes Craven's rather postmodern version of a slasher film with a screenplay written by Kevin Williamson. And actually, Wes Craven had tried to make a postmodern film earlier with a film called The New Nightmare, which was acting as if Freddy Krueger was real. But that set off a chain of teen horror films. Urban Legend, I Know What You Did Last Summer, Valentine is kind of an obscure one. And at the same time, we saw the rise of J-horror, or Japanese horror. And those seem to be the predominant strains up until September 11th, 2001. Now, it took a couple of years, because it always takes movies a couple of years to be made, for the new horror aesthetic to emerge. But when it did, oh my goodness. There is a word that people use to describe this. I don't like that word. Let's just call it extreme gore. Films like Saw and Hostel begat dozens and dozens of other films of a vast variety of different qualities. Also, the aughts was a period of reboots, for horror, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and quite a few others. This went on and got stale by the end of the decade, although my favorite horror film of the 21st century, the French film Martyrs, or Martyrs, was made in 2008. But nevertheless, people were in the mood for something different, and eventually you had films like The Conjuring and Insidious, which were making their way into popular culture with a new kind of supernatural vibe. And then we get to this thing by the mid-decade called elevated horror, and I'm not a big fan of this phrase myself. Films like The Witch, or later Hereditary, and on and on. And right now, that style is kind of fading away, and something more spectacular, more a bit of irony, but we haven't reached the horror comedy phase yet. But we certainly are in the process of something new occurring during this period. Now, meanwhile, as this is happening, the odds were financially absolutely successful. You had the Lord of the Rings franchise, which was absolutely crucial. You had the Harry Potter franchise. You had comedies, so many comedies, although they were a bit on the raunchy side, much more raunchy than any decade previously. And I think that's part of the reason there was eventually a backlash against them. You had action films, and particularly like the Jason Bourne films, the newly retooled James Bond franchise with Daniel Craig, all emphasizing this more realistic, gritty approach to violence and action. And then, of course, you had the Dark Knight films by Christopher Nolan, the new gritty, super gritty Batman movies, with the standout being The Dark Knight, particularly Heath Ledger's Joker film. And then you had the rise of the Marvel comic universe, starting with Iron Man and going on to Thor, and then connecting all of these stories, much as the comic books were connected. Now, if you were to come into the scene in the early teens, say 2012 or whatever, everything would seem healthy. But something was already happening that was going to change everything. So what's been happening is that the strength of genres has been fading. Now, someone not long ago said that people no longer come for the movie star, they come for Spider-Man, they come for Batman, they come for Superman, they come for Iron Man. And there's a certain amount of truth to that, so that Robert Downey Jr. is famous for doing Iron Man. But Robert Downey Jr. doesn't draw people simply on the basis of his name. The only actual movie star, maybe we have two left right now. One is, the biggest one is Tom Cruise, and the other one is Brad Pitt. Both of them can still draw people, but not to everything they do. They have to be in the right film. So Tom Cruise was really successful in Top Gun Maverick, and that helped lift the spirits of the movie industry to say, we're back, baby. But then the last two Mission Impossible movies didn't bring in as much as they were hoping. Part of the problem with that is also they were made for far too much. We're talking budgets of $300, $400 million, which is absolutely insane. This is what has also plagued the Star Wars franchise, the Marvel superhero franchise, DC Comics universe, for whatever that was worth, and other films. The budgets just ballooned out of shape into the stratosphere. And so this has been killing the genres because they can't make their money back. And part of the reason for that is because there's been a huge bifurcation between the hopes for these billion-dollar blockbusters that will come along and knock it out of the park, baseball term for you Europeans, and will essentially, save the studios. And on the other hand, the relative scarcity of mid-budget films, which used to occasionally have a great hit, which brought in much more profit for the studios relative to their budget. But there is a reason why the mid-budget films have been disappearing, and that reason is primarily, as we all know, it's streaming. The fact that you can just sit at home, pick up your magic wand, point it at the screen, click Netflix, because most wands these days, most remote controls have a little button that says Netflix on it, and then just watch whatever you want to watch. And of course, Netflix for a while was considered the golden goose because they made so much money and had so many movies. And then all of the other major movie studios looked at that and said, hey, we're Disney. We need to put our stuff on our channel. Hey, we're Paramount. We need our own channel. We need our own system, online presence, streaming platform. And so they did this. And now there's too many to follow. Essentially what's happened is that streaming costs so much now, it's become cable television 2.0. And I find Netflix to be quite problematic because essentially convenience kills. So now everyone can just sit, veg out, Netflix and chill, which somehow is a code word for sex. And then we no longer go to the movie theaters. So then the movie theater experience has been radically changing because it's now feast or famine, mostly famine. And so that's made the actual box office numbers quite disturbing if you look at them. The pre-pandemic numbers have never quite come back. Although every now and then you'll have a huge hit, the Barbenheimer phenomena. You have Spider-Man, No Way Home. This year you had, of all things, the Minecraft movie, which was quite a sinister omen, if you ask me. Because if that's the future of movies, we're all in trouble. And movie theaters are going to have to do a lot more cleaning up because there was so much popcorn and other stuff being thrown around by Gen Zers and below who'd never been in a movie theater, it seems, and didn't know how to, even the basic rules of being in a movie theater. That's another problem. Movie theaters have become much more problematic because people don't know when to turn off their phones. They seem to think they're watching television, so they keep talking. And not talking, interacting with the film as you would find in a great grindhouse theater where everyone's going like, don't do that. Well, that can be a lot of fun. But I mean, just talking because this is a boring section of the film, blah, blah, blah. I think I might as well look at my phone. That's another reason why films have been fading from our public consciousness. And then there's the loss of the story. And what I mean by this is, stories used to be so crucial. Now, every age looks at the age before it and says, what happened to the stories? So the people in the 1960s were looking at films and looking back at the classic era of Hollywood, the Hollywood studio system, which really did focus on stories much more than any films do today. But people in the late 60s and 70s would go like, whatever happened to those stories? Instead, in the 1970s, they were telling stories that were much more reality-oriented and existential. And those got quite dark. I think 1976 being a pinnacle year of darkness. And those continued up until 1980, which I don't care what anyone says, is part of the decade of the 70s, because do your math. Don't be stupid and just do what everyone does. Oh, there's a zero now. We must be in a new decade, a new millennium. I'm not going to go on that too much right now, but I do have thoughts about it. I actually have a German book, and guess what? It starts every decade with 1, not 0. because they understand what a set of numbers is. It's just the insanity of the way America, the strength of our culture, have pushed this concept onto everyone that somehow a decade starts with zero. I don't need to get on my high horse, but this just irks me so much. But if you look back, say we'll take a year like 2002. Doesn't seem like a particularly auspicious year, but 2002. And we're going to compare it to today, 2002. Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. So we're not at the beginning and we're not at the end of The Lord of the Rings. Brought in what all of these films, these first three, brought in well over what would be $1 billion in today's money. Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. Again, well over $1 billion in today's money. Spider-Man, the first Sony movie, well over $1 billion. And all of those were good films that featured the story above everything else. Other films from that year, The Pianist by Roman Polanski. I don't care what you think of him. I think this film was him trying to atone for his sins. And the fact is, this film, for me, was the best film of the year. The Pianist, absolutely brilliant. Story, character, signs. Again, another director that a lot of people hit or miss, and that is Mr. M. Night Shyamalan. And it's like Signs was actually a very good, very scary, very odd film. Then you have Chicago, a pretty decent musical. You have Gangs of New York. I can quibble a bit about some of the acting, particularly from the female sector in that movie. But The Gangs of New York was a very interesting movie. A bit of a failure, but a great movie nonetheless. Adaptation, Charlie Kaufman film with 2 Nicolas Cages. How can you go wrong? The Hours, featuring Nicole Kidman with a prosthetic nose. She wins an Academy Award. That's what you have to do to win an Academy Award. Take your little dot of a nose and make it more of a true nose. Hero, great Chinese kind of supernatural adventure film in the mold of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. And then we had The Bourne Identity. Again, a great action film from the action decade. Punch Drunk Love. Paul Thomas Anderson with, of all people, Adam Sandler doing both of their best films. Minority Report. Steven Spielberg pulls off an amazing science fiction movie. City of God, Brazilian film about the favelas. Oh my goodness, talk about an intense story. And then Spirited Away, Miyazaki, and then Frida, a Julie Taymor film about Frida Kahlo. These are the films of that year. All of these would be seen as greater than any film this year. And as much as I like films like Sinners and Weapons, no, they're not better than most of those films. I mean, some of them they are, but for the most part, those films were about stories. And we are still trying to get our bearings again on what makes a good story. We haven't done it. And the studios are now realizing what a huge mistake they've made by ignoring story in favor of the imposition of, and I say this with the critical drinker, the message. And this message, this DEI, woke, trans, hyper-feminist, not in the good sense, message has been polluting films since the middle of the last decade. And now people are just rejecting these films outright. The Marvel films have all been failing because they still have an injection of this toxin in their system. People, no one wants to see a Pixar film with the message in it. It's just propaganda. And I'm not saying there's right-wing propaganda. That doesn't fix the problem. I'm saying we need good stories. And I think anyone who's sensitive to this moment knows what I'm talking about. Then we have the attempt to resurrect genres that have died. It is surprising to me that comedy has essentially died. Now, like I say, a lot of people will point back to how many comedies there were in the aughts, to which I'm saying, yeah, And they were funny, but here's the thing about all of them. Most of the really funniest ones would have been considered way over the edge by any other standards. And this goes along with the videos of the time. This goes along with a lot of the music, particularly in the early part of the decade. Also, the horror films were over the edge. And so it doesn't surprise me that there came a moment when people were trying to pull back and didn't know how. So this year, they released a new version of Naked Gun with Liam Neeson. It did all right, but it didn't resurrect comedy. Unfortunately, comedy has been siphoned off to Netflix land. And in Netflix land, it's been, interestingly enough, Netflix has been great for stand-up comedy. And we'll let people say whatever. But all the sitcoms and all of the, various types of comedy series and such, very few of them have been any good. We've lost the ability. Part of it is this whole message thing has made laughing at stuff. Now people go back and look at Seinfeld or Friends as being somehow poisonous. You can't touch them. And oops, they said a bad word there. And oops, the implication was that bad there. And we have to get beyond this. We have to get to the point where, you know what? A comedy that insults people isn't that bad. It's a comedy. And I would say we are hitting kind of a golden age right now for a certain kind of YouTube video where you have people staring at the cameras and being different characters. I'm looking at you, Julie Noki, and Ryan George. Foil Arms and Hog do great skit comedy on from Ireland on YouTube. Ryan Long, completely over the edge. A Canadian who has relocated to New York City. Crazy stuff he does. But here's the thing. We need to laugh again. And we need to find out a way to do it. We can incorporate some sensitivity. But if we incorporate too much, we're doomed. We've also tried to resurrect the action genre. We've had a little more success there. Top Gun Maverick, as I pointed out, and F1 this year with Brad Pitt. Excellent film. No message, but the kind of message you would basically get from a racing movie. War films haven't been exactly hot the last few years, but this year's Warfare was something new. And it gives me hope. This was far more realistic than most war films you'll ever see, and I thought it deserves a lot of accolades. It's not a great story, it's basically just one day. But it's an attempt. Likewise, science fiction films, we've had good science fiction films. And I think the Dune series by Denis Villeneuve is great. But unfortunately, Marvel, through Star Wars, has so disturbed the force by politically revamping it all, it makes people stay away from science fiction. Fortunately, the Dune movies are doing well. So there have been attempts to try to resurrect genres that were always good. But this whole Disney acquisitions thing, buying Fox, buying Lucasfilms, and the MCU all together, it's just been terrible for movies. So the present is something new. We've never been in a moment like this before. You can always make analogies. During the pandemic period, people were saying, I wish I was in the 60s. And I'm going, save the time travel costs. You're already there. You're in a memorable time in history with a lot of chaos and confusion. It mixes up a lot of things into this. But one thing we can say right now, here in 2025, is that no one on earth can predict what 2026 will look like. During the Cold War, for all of its tension, we had a pretty good idea we're probably not going to blow ourselves up this year, and the tensions will remain. You can't travel behind the Iron Curtain, can't go to Cuba, you still can't, but you can go, life will continue. There's more rock music, there's more television, there's more movies. But now where we are, and I think the extra thing that I haven't mentioned, besides the absolute cultural chaos, has been the technological chaos. Now, I mentioned this a bit when we talk about streaming, but AI now is going to change everything. And why? It's not going to make it better. So, for instance, people right now get a lot of their music through Spotify. And I can't tell you what a sad devil's bargain you've made. You've taken convenience and you've helped to kill music. That's the cost. You get your convenience, music is dying. And the nail in the coffin is AI, and Spotify is promoting AI music. And I'll bet a lot of it is in-house AI music. When I walk around a certain shopping mall here in Tbilisi, Georgia, now, maybe shopping malls aren't cool where you live anymore, but here they are because they're a relatively new thing. This one mall is always playing just electronic music. And it's faceless, And when they replace that music with AI, nobody will ever know or care because the music doesn't matter. Our listening habits have changed so much that all we have is the music from the past. Because the music going into the future, you look down the road, it's not looking good. Now, there is an antidote to that, and that's called real music in real time and real space. But so far, the larger momentum of society has not realized this yet. They are stuck in convenience mode. If you're watching this, I'm asking you to question convenience mode. All that streaming, it's not helping anyone. You're just killing things because it consumes far too much, far too quickly. And what do you learn from it? Not much. When you had to pay to go to a movie, you would remember that movie. You don't remember stuff on your screen the same way you do when you take the time to go to a movie theater. Which is why I take the time to go to horror films. Now, the horror film occupies a place that's very unusual in our society. And it's been doing this for about, 10 years, more or less. Not every film. There's still a lot of trash being made. There is always horror trash being made. But there are a lot of films that have something extra. And the word that's often used is elevated horror. It's a word I and many horror aficionados don't like. What was Rosemary's Baby? Was that not elevated horror? For that matter, if you go back to the 1920s, what was The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari if not elevated horror? You see? That thing is filled with artistic, not pretensions, but reality. It's just an incredible film. And all the way along, the Val Lewton films, the Cat People, I Walked with a Zombie, all of these are very intelligent horror films. So elevated horror is kind of a non-starter. However, there has been a change in horror. They have adapted, as in the 70s, they've adapted a lot more realism in their approach. Also, the horror, I just saw a guy who was talking about that we live in a time of insecure horror, where the horror doesn't know who the monster is anymore. Also, we live in a time of absolute genre bending when it comes to horror. And people will argue, was this a horror? Was that a horror? Is that a horror? Is that a thriller? Is that a drama? And I think that's part of the chaos of our times. Nevertheless, there have been films from the last few years that I think are really important, and they are asking serious questions. I don't agree with all their questions. That's not the point. The point is that when you walk out, your brain is moving. And there isn't another genre doing anything like that now. Will this period last? Well, it's already beginning perhaps to fade because we're starting to see more comedy coming into the horror. But we haven't reached the point yet of a lot of horror comedies. Will we? I don't know. Because comedy is so squeamish online, on television, the horror comedy may have to come back just to blow things open. But I don't know. I can't predict the future. Nobody can. But as I tell my friends, the horror film now is the most intellectual and philosophical genre there is. And I've been saying this for the last 25 years. And it's remained true. Yeah, sometimes the imagery is way over the top, and you will remember certain set pieces, certain images for the rest of your life. But once the initial movement, sometimes it's like traumatic, it's too much. But once that subsides, you are then left with questions. Now, as I said, I don't agree with necessarily all of the perspectives of these films at all. But the very fact that they're raising questions, they are questioning the times we're in. They don't have answers. But it's not the horror film's job to provide answers. It's the horror film's job to provide questions, to provide mystery, to provide a glimpse into something else. The theater is the best place to see horror films, which is why I've been miffed for a long time that I have not been able to watch the movie Barbarian. I can't get it on a DVD or Blu-ray. When I briefly tried to watch it, I had a 1-month subscription about 2 years ago to Netflix just to catch up on some stuff. And it wasn't on there anymore. They'd taken it off. It's going out, making the rounds somewhere else. And I feel like having these kinds of films on the television or the computer screen, or worse, the phone screen, is just the wrong thing. When you go into a movie theater, it's much more like a dream, and many horror films operate like dreams. Horror doesn't require political vetting in the same way that so many other genres these days do, which is why it has continued to be strong. Horror doesn't need gargantuan budgets to succeed, and various views can be accepted from Christian to postmodernists. So there's a wide variety of views that are instantiated in horror films. When it comes down to it, we live in perhaps the most extremely unpredictable times that there have ever been. And our horror matches our fear and uncertainty. Now, I know there are those people who say, yeah, but you need to remain positive. I'm not talking about negative or positive here. I'm talking about raising questions. And that's what good horror does. And I think in every year, we've had quite a bit of good horror. This year, I could point to Sinners. Ryan Coogler's film is an excellent horror film. I think Weapons, that's still in theaters as I'm speaking, is an excellent horror film. Bring Her Back is similar in some ways to Weapons in its message about children, but it is also an excellent film, if perhaps the most disturbing on this list. And last year, I could think of 20 horror films really worth going to a movie theater to see, and some of them really great. Ranging from films as mysterious as Stop Motion, what was that about? To films like The Substance, which seemed to be about, what the body is and stuff. Maybe a little too direct, which is why it didn't make my favorite film of the year. Although my favorite film of the year was also direct. It was Heretic. And I think I like that mostly because, although it seems to be a film challenging the notion of faith, if you watch till the end, it reverses itself, which to me was very interesting. So it throws it up in the air. Nosferatu last year was an excellent remake. And there were so many more. I mean, I really loved the third Terrifier movie. And I've seen that there's kind of a spiritual thing creeping into it as it goes. So, that's all I want to say. I just want to point out that we live in a time where horror has become the most important genre. And one of the reasons it's the most important genres is because most of the other ones have fallen away. And we live in a time of extreme uncertainty. And horror is not infected in the same way by the message Horror doesn't require gargantuan budgets, and horror still works great in a movie theater. And if you're the kind of person who likes to think, as opposed to the kind of person who just wants to drift, then I would recommend going to a horror film. One way to do it is to kind of keep your eyes peeled for the film that people are talking about in some kind of way that seems to be crucial. Now, a lot of people call it, when all these people are talking about it, they all start talking about, oh, it's being hyped up, it's being hyped up. Last year, for instance, I know many people who went to see Longlegs and says, oh, the hype. And I'm sitting there going like, well, I didn't watch anything before I saw Longlegs. I just knew I should watch it. And it was a great film. And I still don't know what they mean by the hype. Hype now is being used for like, too many people are talking about this, I don't want to see it. Or, it's not going to deliver what I want. Well, I don't go to a horror film expecting it to deliver what I want. I go wondering what it's going to say, what it's going to do. And if it's good, it's good. If it's not, it's not. It's that simple. And there are horror films I don't like. And horror films, I read the description and say, I can avoid that. Or this one's got the message all over it. Maybe this one I can leave behind. But last year was a particularly good film. I have made a video about why 2024 was so good. So, we'll stop there. Thank you for watching. Hey, I have a Patreon. You should go look at it. It's the one place where all of my channels are going to come together. I haven't quite uploaded everything over there yet or made all the links, but there is plenty of stuff over there that's not over here. There's my interview with a woman about Russian punk rock. There are videos over there. Oh, you can watch my 2-hour interview with the Quay brothers. Also coming up there soon will be my interview with Jan Schrankmeyer, puppet film animator. I've got a lot of stuff, and I will be putting more and more of my early versions of the videos there. And for instance, there are some videos that I know, okay, someone's going to stop me from publishing this, and they're going to make a claim, a copyright claim. Not that I can make any money. See, this is one of the things some of you don't understand. Because I live in Tbilisi, Georgia, because of the issues related to YouTube and the issues related to my bank in Alaska, I can't make any money from YouTube on these videos. If you like them, and you have to support me yourself. That's the basic thing. So there are a couple ways to do it. One, go join the Patreon. Two, actually more direct, since all my Patreon money has to go through PayPal anyway, who takes their share, so it's like double the fees plus the other costs. You can donate through PayPal below, and eventually I'm going to make it so that all the PayPal people get into my Patreon for free. So if you can do it either way, or you can buy a copy of my book, of my 3 puppet plays, very strange stuff, $25, helps support the channel. Anything you can do. And if you really want to support the channel, you can go over and spend $35 on my Patreon for my 86-hour history of the 20th century in audio actualities. Okay, enough of that. Subscribe, like, share the video. Think about these things, more importantly. This is Bern in Tbilisi saying Nakwamdis and Droabit. Temporarily, we will meet again.
When I go, I want you to give me 5 minutes. I told you boys I'm no escape artist. For the first time, I like the odds.
At the round earth's imagined corners, blow your trumpets, angels, and arise, arise from death, you numberless infinities of souls.